Picture this. Your country is facing the greatest military threat in its history. The enemy is coming. Everyone knows it. Your best general, the one man who has spent 15 years building the doctrine that could stop that enemy, is sitting in a cell. Not because he betrayed his country, because the guy in charge was afraid of him. That's not a hypothetical. That's exactly what happened in the Soviet Union between 1937 and 1941. Mikhail Tukhachevsky was the most brilliant military mind the Red Army ever produced. He didn't just command armies. He redesigned how armies think. He spent the 1930s building a framework for modern war that was so far ahead of its time that the Germans, the same Germans who nearly destroyed the Soviet Union, only fully understood it by fighting against it years after Tukhachevsky was dead. Stalin had him shot on June 12, 1937. 4 years later, when Nazi Germany launched the largest land invasion in history across the Soviet border, the Red Army fought that war using Tukhachevsky's playbook. The operations that stopped Germany at Moscow in 1941, the encirclement at Stalingrad in 1942, the destruction of Army Group Center in 1944, all of them were built on ideas that a dead man had left behind in training manuals that no purge could reach. This is a story Americans should recognize. It's the story of what happens when a system decides that loyalty matters more than competence. When the people at the top are more afraid of their own best people than of the enemy outside. When the institution destroys exactly what it needs most, and then has to figure out how to survive without it. We've seen versions of this story before, in corporate boardrooms, in government agencies, in military commands that relieved their best officers for saying things nobody wanted to hear. Tukhachevsky's story is the most extreme version of that pattern that history has ever recorded, and it almost cost 50 million people their lives. To understand why Stalin killed Tukhachevsky, you need to understand what kind of threat a genuinely brilliant person poses to a system built on fear. Stalin's Soviet Union in the 1930s ran on loyalty, not competence. The people who survived and rose were the ones who demonstrated absolute personal devotion to Stalin, not the ones who were independently capable or who had their own ideas. Independent capability was dangerous. It meant you could exist without Stalin. And in Stalin's system, that was the most dangerous thing you could be. Tukhachevsky was independently capable in every possible way. He had built a network of officers who were loyal to his intellectual vision, to the ideas, not to the political leader. He had developed a theory of warfare that didn't require Stalin to be valid, and he had the kind of charisma and institutional credibility that could, under the right circumstances, make him a legitimate alternative to Stalin's authority. Between 1937 and 1938, Stalin's purges wiped out approximately 35,000 Red Army officers. 3 of the 5 Soviet marshals were executed. 13 of 15 army commanders were executed. The officers who replaced them were younger, less experienced, and completely dependent on Stalin for their survival. That was the point. Think about what this looked like from the inside. Imagine you're a Soviet officer in 1941. You've watched your commanding general get arrested. You've watched his replacement get arrested. You've watched officers get shot for making tactical decisions that turned out to be wrong. You know that being wrong, not corrupt, not treasonous, just militarily wrong, can get you killed. That's the army that faced Nazi Germany on June 22, 1941. German Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, one of the sharpest military minds in the Wehrmacht, wrote after the war that when he studied Soviet deep operations doctrine, he found a level of conceptual sophistication that no German theorist had matched systematically before 1941. What Tukhachevsky had written in the 1930s, the Germans spent years learning by fighting against it. Mikhail Tukhachevsky was born in 1893. He was a junior officer in World War I, captured by the Germans in 1915, spent years in a prisoner of war camp, and used that time the way genuinely obsessive military thinkers use time, studying the battles he'd lost with the same intensity he would later study the battles he planned to win. After joining the Red Army in 1918, he rose fast. By the late 1920s, he was chief of staff. By the early 1930s, he was the intellectual center of Soviet military thinking. The doctrine he developed, deep battle operations, was built on a premise that cut against everything the conventional military wisdom of the era assumed. Most military thinking in the 1930s was about how to break through the enemy's front line. Tukhachevsky asked a different question. What happens to the defender after the front line breaks? His answer changed everything. If you attack the enemy's front line in one place, they can move reserves to plug the gap. But if you attack simultaneously across the entire depth of their defensive system, front line and rear areas and command infrastructure all at once, they can't respond fast enough anywhere. The reserves that would plug one gap are needed to plug three others. The command system that would coordinate the defense is being disrupted at the same moment the front line is being hit. The whole system collapses, not because any single point failed decisively, but because the total pressure exceeded the total capacity to respond. This sounds obvious when you describe it. It was revolutionary when Tukhachevsky codified it, because making it work required a level of coordination, mobility, and logistical support that no army in the world had achieved in 1932. Tukhachevsky didn't just develop the theory, he built the institutional structures to make it real. General Konstantin Rokossovsky, one of the rare senior officers who survived the Purge, having been arrested, tortured, and then released, described in his memoirs the effect of Stalin's purges on Red Army performance in the first months of the war. In 1941, we had officers who were afraid to make decisions without checking with Moscow, because they knew that a wrong decision could cost them their lives. Not their lives in combat, their lives in front of a firing squad. That fear was as real as German fire, and it paralyzed with the same efficiency. Rokossovsky survived the Purge partly because the Soviet Union desperately needed his skills by 1941, and released him from prison to command troops. He understood from personal experience exactly what the Purge had done to the institution he served. If this is giving you a different way to think about what happens when organizations destroy their best people, subscribe and hit the bell. New video every week. Back to the story. Here's the part that makes Tukhachevsky's story more than just a Soviet tragedy. The charges against him were fabricated, and not by Stalin's secret police working alone. German intelligence, the SD under Reinhard Heydrich, manufactured documents suggesting Tukhachevsky was collaborating with Germany and fed them to Stalin through Czech intermediaries. Heydrich had made a cold calculation. Tukhachevsky was the most dangerous element in the Red Army. If Germany could convince Stalin that Tukhachevsky was a traitor, Stalin would do their work for them. No assassination required. No German operation exposed. Just a paranoid dictator receiving forged evidence and acting exactly as Heydrich predicted he would. It worked better than Heydrich had planned. Stalin didn't just remove Tukhachevsky. He removed 35,000 officers. He destroyed the institution so thoroughly that when Germany actually invaded 4 years later, the Red Army was a fraction of what it would have been if Tukhachevsky had lived. And here's the final irony. The same Germany that engineered Tukhachevsky's death then invaded the Soviet Union and spent 4 years getting destroyed by the doctrine that Tukhachevsky had left behind in the training manuals. Heydrich got exactly what he wanted, and it still wasn't enough. The summer and fall of 1941 looked like exactly what you'd expect from an army whose leadership had been systematically destroyed. The German encirclements at Bialystok, Kiev, and Vyazma Bryansk captured or destroyed millions of Soviet soldiers. Officers who survived described a command climate where making the wrong call, not betraying your country, just being tactically wrong, could mean a tribunal and a firing squad. Initiative had been trained out of the institution. The officers who remained were the ones who had learned to wait for orders rather than act on judgment. But something survived the Purge that no execution could reach. Tukhachevsky's doctrine was in the training manuals, and the training manuals were still in the military schools. The officers who had studied deep operations theory in the 1930s were still alive, in lower ranks, waiting. As the war exposed the inadequacy of the older generation of commanders, those younger officers started moving up. Zhukov, Rokossovsky, Vatutin, Konev, Chuikov. Every single one of them had trained in the intellectual system that Tukhachevsky had built. Operation Uranus in November 1942. The encirclement of the German 6th Army at Stalingrad was the first large-scale application of deep operations doctrine. 2 simultaneous attacks against the weaker Romanian flanks, rapid exploitation into the German rear, encirclement before the German command could respond. Tukhachevsky had described this exact sequence in his 1932 manual. He had been dead for 5 years when his ideas wrapped around an entire German army. Operation Bagration in June 1944 was the complete expression of everything Tukhachevsky had theorized. 4 Soviet fronts attacking simultaneously across a 900-mile line. The German Army Group Center, the same formation that had nearly reached Moscow in 1941, lost 28 divisions in a week. Military historians have called it the greatest single military disaster in German history, greater than Stalingrad in terms of divisions destroyed. It was Tukhachevsky's playbook, executed by officers he had trained, against the army whose intelligence service had engineered his death. Marshal Alexander Vasilevsky, who rose to become one of the chief architects of Soviet operational planning during the war, wrote about Tukhachevsky with a frankness that Soviet-era censorship rarely permitted. Tukhachevsky saw things the rest of us took years to understand, not because he was smarter, because he looked at the problem from a different angle. When others were thinking about how to break through the enemy's line, he was already thinking about what to do with the defender after the line had been broken. That difference in perspective made his solutions look impossible, until they turned out to be the only ones that worked. Vasilevsky's description cuts to something that doctrinal analysis can't capture: the difference between a tactician and a systems thinker. Tukhachevsky didn't solve individual battles. He designed the framework within which individual battles found their place. Americans have a complicated relationship with this kind of story. On one hand, the United States has its own history of military institutions removing officers who said things that made their superiors uncomfortable. Billy Mitchell was court-martialed for publicly advocating air power in 1925. He was right about everything. It took Pearl Harbor to prove it. Curtis LeMay spent years fighting institutional resistance to strategic bombing concepts that later defined American air power. More recently, Army Chief of Staff Eric Shinseki testified before Congress in 2003 that the Iraq occupation would require several 100,000 troops. He was marginalized for it. The occupation unfolded almost exactly as he had predicted. The pattern is not uniquely Soviet. The difference is one of scale and consequence. Stalin's version of the pattern killed tens of millions of people. The American version has been costly in different ways. But the underlying dynamic, the institution that treats loyalty as more valuable than competence, that interprets independent capability as threat rather than asset, shows up in every large organization, in every era. Tukhachevsky's story is the most extreme case study in what that pattern looks like when there are no institutional constraints on how far it goes. And it's a reminder that the ideas of genuinely original thinkers are harder to kill than the thinkers themselves. The Soviet Union learned that the hard way. They paid for it with 27 million lives. And they won anyway, because the ideas were in the books, and the books waited. Stalin killed Tukhachevsky because he was afraid of him. That fear was rational within the logic of Stalin's system. A man with Tukhachevsky's capabilities, with a network of officers loyal to his ideas rather than to Stalin personally, with the kind of institutional credibility that comes from being genuinely right about important things. That man was a real threat to a system built on personal loyalty and fear. What Stalin didn't fully calculate, or calculated and accepted, was the price the Soviet Union would pay for that security. The catastrophic losses of 1941, the millions of soldiers who died in the first year of the war, partly because the command structure had been gutted and traumatized. Those deaths were not just the result of German superiority. They were the direct cost of the Purge. The Soviet Union paid that price, and then won the war anyway. The lesson here isn't clean. It's not, if you destroy your best people, you lose. The Soviet Union proved that's not necessarily true. The lesson is something more specific and more uncomfortable. Ideas are harder to kill than people. If your best thinker leaves behind a framework solid enough to survive their death, documented, codified, taught to the next generation, then killing the thinker doesn't destroy the thinking. It just delays it. And it cost you enormously in the transition. Tukhachevsky built something that outlasted him. He wrote it down. He trained officers who internalized it. He created an intellectual infrastructure that no firing squad could reach. The Soviet Union destroyed its best general and survived because the best general had done his job so well that he made himself partially replaceable. The men who studied his doctrine replaced him imperfectly, at enormous cost, over years of the worst fighting in human history. But they replaced him. That is both the most hopeful and the most sobering thing about this story. The ideas survived. The cost of the transition was 27 million lives.